My talk today will be on a very different aspect, and I'm interested in the way that esoteric forces and legends and symbols are actually used in the 20th and 21st centuries. And so what I'll talk about today is the Black Sun, the Vril force, and how this led to a very dark phase in human history during the 20th century. Because at the end of World War II, the victorious Allies were startled to find there was a massive archive of documented material which indicated the extent to which investigations and projects into occult concepts and other world powers had been carried out by the Third Reich. There was evidence that attempts had been made to harness energy to produce flying saucers. A fleet of super submarines had been manufactured and had disappeared, apparently into thin air. An Antarctic base had been founded to investigate entry points into a subterranean world at the poles, and it was rumoured that many prominent Nazis, some say including Hitler, had been smuggled out of Germany to these unknown places. Unfortunately, each of these topics is a subject in itself, and so I can only touch on them during my talk today. But if anybody wishes to do so, we can explore each one in detail at a later date. But today I just want to outline the ideology underlying Nazi philosophy during the Third Reich. That sounds a bit dry, but we shall see. I find it quite interesting. So they essentially wanted to harness a thing called the Vril force, V-R-I-L. Now, what is the Vril force? Well, it's said to be derived from the Black Sun, and the Black Sun is a large ball of prima materia, or elemental force, which supposedly exists at the centre of the Earth and gives light to people called Vrilia, and it puts out radiation in the form of a force called Vril. Now, this force has been known to ancients under many other names. For example, it's sometimes been called Chi, Orchas, Vril, astral light, odic forces, or orgone. And in a discussion during of the 28th degree of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, the Knight of the Sun, or Prince Adept, Albert Pike said there is in nature one most potent force by whereof a single man, if he could possess himself of it, would know how to direct it, he could revolutionise and change the face of the world. So he believed it was a very potent unitary force that could be used for evil or for good. Now, there was a Vril society in the early years of the 20th century, sometimes known as the Luminous Lodge, and that combined political ideas of the Order of Illuminati, and it combined it with Hindu mysticism, theosophy, and the Kabbalah. And this was the first German nationalist group to use the symbol of the swastika as an emblem linking Eastern and Western occult practices. Now, the members will remember that one of the meetings I gave a quick talk on the swastika as a mystical symbol and the way it had been misused again during the Second World War. But the society had latched onto the swastika as a very old archetype, and it was already in the minds of the old alchemists and magicians, and was reinterpreted by a man called Lytton in the light of an age of occult revival and scientific progress. The elements claimed as truth were that when the energy form called Vril rose and conquered the surface of the earth, a superior subterranean master race would also arise, and there were some very wealthy and influential theosophists who accepted that as the truth and began to act upon those beliefs. Now, a novel was written called The Coming Race in the late 1800s, which centred on the story of a mining engineer who accidentally finds himself in a subterranean kingdom occupied by beings, the race of the Vril, and they to him seem to resemble angels. He soon discovers that they are the descendants of the inhabitants of Atlantis, and they have access to this extraordinary Vril force. They can control it at will, and they use it sometimes for destruction, sometimes as a healing force. And Vril can be changed into an animate and an inanimate form. It can destroy like lightning, or it can replenish life, and it can heal, or it can cure. Now that's got some similarities to the Ark of the Covenant, I would suggest, that Max has been talking about. Now the hero in the novel was treated by the Vril as a pet who might have to be put down, or at least kept in confinement to protect their secrets. But he escaped from the subterranean realm with the knowledge that this race intends to someday resurface and take control of the surface lives, that's us, hence the title, The Coming Race. Now, the book was very popular in the late 19th century, and for a time the word Vril came to be associated with life-giving elixirs. The subterranean people of the earth used the Vril force to operate and govern the world, and a few children armed with Vril-powered rods were said to be capable of exterminating a race of over 22 million threatening barbarians, so it's a very powerful force. They were able to fly on Vril-powered wings, coming back to your point about the passages in the Bible that people had wings, and they were racially and culturally superior to everybody else on earth, above or below the ground. And at one time, the narrator concluded that this people, the Vril, were descended from the same ancestors as a great Aryan family from which varied streams had flowed to dominate civilization. It's important to note that the Vril society, that is the early occult society in Germany, believed that the Aryans were the actual biological ancestors connected to the Black Sun. Now they believed that whoever became master of the Vril would also be master of himself and others around him, and the belief was that the world would change and lords would emerge from the centre of the earth. And unless the National Socialists, the Nazis, could make an alliance with them and become lords themselves, they would find themselves among the slaves and basically on the scrap heap to be used to build new cities that would arise. So in Berlin, the luminous lodge of the Vril Society was founded by a man called Karl Haushofer, who was a student of the Russian magician and metaphysician George Gurdjieff. And together they maintained they had contacts with secret Tibetan lodges that possessed the secret of the Superman. Now that seems to be a bit of an offshoot, but as we'll see, We'll come back to the Tibetan connection a little later. The Society organised expeditions to Tibet during the period 1926 to 1942, and in an attempt to contact the cave oracle dwellers, or sometimes called the Green Men. The objective of the Luminous Lodge was to explore the origins of the Aryan race and to perform exercises in concentration to awaken the forces of Vril. The lodge included Hitler, Rosenberg, Himmler, Göring, and Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Vril. It's also known that Aleister Crowley and Gurdjieff had some contact with that lodge as they had with Hitler himself. And Hitler's unusual powers of suggestion become more understandable if we keep in mind that he may have had access to these secret psychological techniques of Gurdjieff, which in turn were based on the teachings of the Sufis and the Tibetan Lamas, and familiarised him with the teaching of what is known as the Japanese Society of the Green Dragon. Now that's a society devoted to mastering control of both human and etheric bodies. It gives access to great powers and also gives powers of prophecy. The founder of the Luminous Lodge, Haushofer, was one of only 3 Westerners ever to be admitted to that society. Vows were required as a member, and the penalty for failure was to commit suicide by harakiri. In Germany, adepts of the society were known as, it was known as the Society of the Green Men, and the foremost personage within that society was known as the Monk of Green Gloves. Green Men were dissolved in 1944 as Haushofer's son was involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler. So he forced them actually to close at that point. That's just really an aside. Now, the Vrilia was said to have originated in the solar system of Aldebaran, 68 light years from Earth. And there were 2 women who were said to have channeled messages from Aldebaran itself, which was a planetary system with 2 inhabited planets that revolved around its own sun. The inhabitants of the system were divided into a master or godlike white Aryan race and subservient other races. This would have happened because there was a climate change, quite a fashionable topic, on the individual planets, which was the result of the sun itself start to expand. And so because of that, they were looking for ways to escape, and they started to, the master race and the subservient races began to intermingle, resulting in a degeneration, and the mutants had got less spiritual development than the original white, godlike Aryan race. The more they mixed, the more their spiritual development was degraded, and consequently, as the sun began to grow, the subservients no longer had the knowledge or the ability to travel by interplanetary means like their ancestors, and it became impossible for them to leave their planets. So they became totally dependent on the remainder of the master race and were evacuated in spacecraft and taken to other habitable planets. All sounds a bit fanciful, but I'm leading up to the fact that a lot of this was used during the 20th century as a political weapon. Now, because there was some respect held between the 2 races, the white man gods relented and decided that they would take some of the subservient races with them as they began to colonize other planets similar to Earth over a period of about 500 million years. And as the growth of the Aldebaran sun made the planets more and more uninhabitable. Some say that they eventually colonised the planet Malona, sometimes called Marduk, Marduk or Phaeton, and that planet existed between Mars and Jupiter. It's a belt that's now occupied by the asteroids. They then moved on to colonise our own solar system, and the idea of mutation and transformation into a higher form of God-man came into being. Now, this has got some connection, not with meteorites, but with people actually coming down out of the sky and starting to colonise Earth. And there are many other theories which we can't go into today about a race of giants that actually inhabited the Earth. So being intermediate between man and other intelligent beings would place at the disposal of the Vril Society in Germany a reservoir of forces that could be drawn down to enable Germany to dominate the world and be the cradle of a coming race of supermen who would result from mutations of the human species in turn. And one day these legions would set out to annihilate everything that stood in the way of their spiritual destiny on earth, and their leaders would be men who knew everything, deriving their strength from the fountainhead of energy and guided by the great ones of the ancient world. So there came about the doctrine of the racial supremacy of the Aryan or Indo-European peoples. And from these, in turn, stemmed the science of eugenics in the 1920s. Again, I don't know how familiar you are with eugenics, but it is basically, I suppose, a corruption of Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest, in that anybody who you deem is substandard, or whatever standards you're using, you should actually not read from them and maybe actively do away with them. And so that resulted ultimately as the basis of the Holocaust. Now, there are other aspects of the Vril Society which have surfaced in the archives, and amongst them is a startling claim that there was a secret Nazi UFO program. There's a postulation that the Vril Society established contact with the secret chiefs of Aurelia, who secretly began cooperating with German scientists in the late 1920s. And it's known that as early as 1926, Hitler was sending teams of spelunkers, or cave searchers, into caves and mines all over Europe, searching for the entrances to the subterranean world of the Vril people. Now, they also explored Antarctica quite extensively during the period 37 to 38, in the search for a fabled hole at the South Pole that led into this subterranean world. And apparently they may have had some success in discovering these entrances, and it was here that some say they made contact with unknown supermen who lived in what was called Rainbow City. Now, after the Second World War, a man called Strider said there had been one of the greatest cover-ups of our time was details of what the US military leaders actually learned from these archives, and particularly what they learned about UFOs, and they concealed it from the general public. And in a book called The UFO Secrets of the Third Reich, there's a connection drawn between alien beings, German secret societies, the blacks and the Black Sun. And the author, Tazinski, tells of an alien tutor race that secretly then began cooperating again with German scientists in the 20s and introduced them to concepts of philosophical, cultural and technological progress. And in fact, if you look at some of the archives, there are quite detailed engineering drawings there of UFOs, which I'm no expert, but I'm told could actually fly. And there are also purported to be photographs some which are very hazy and blurred, of UFOs actually flying, particularly around the Antarctic area. Now, anti-gravity research apparently began in Germany in the 1920s, and there was an anti-gravity circular craft called the RFZ-1, which was constructed as a 350-foot long cigar-shaped Andromeda space station. That was made in the old Zeppelin hangars near Berlin, and it was under the auspices of the research and development arm of the SS. Now, there's a number of books that claim that particular theme, and some photographs, as I said, have turned up. Some have been exposed as hoaxes, others remain categorised as unknown. The Allies, however, confiscated every scrap of Nazi documents, and most are still classified even to this day. And it's well known that the Germans had some out of this world research for some time. If in fact the Vril do exist, and the Nazis did indeed establish contact with them, we could assume that the anti-gravity propulsion worked maybe using the principles of the Vril force. The Nazis have also established and were driven by occult groups like the Vril Society. And so whether the tale of the Vril is for real or not really is a bit beside the point. Many seem to have discovered this force independently by other research, and details of it continue to be suppressed. The Vril Society's existence was verified in stolen records which are now in possession of the British intelligence organisations. And the worldview of those who subscribe to the idea of a genuine Nazi occult power include a number of conspiracy theorists, and as I say, they claim that leading Nazis escaped from the ruins of Berlin and still continue through their descendants plans of world domination from a hidden headquarters. Now, it's said that this is from an Antarctic base. There's some evidence that that did actually exist. Some remains have been found. And so the development of flying discs is also another possibility. But again, that's a whole different talk, which again I can expand on a bit later if you're interested. So, at first sight, while these theories seem to have little to do with any known reality today, the idea that the CIA could have smuggled many personnel from wartime Nazi intelligence and German secret weapons programs into the United States, that may seem outlandish, but there is a document called Project Paperclip, which was a program authorised by Joint Chiefs of Staff to exploit Nazi scientific and engineering knowledge. And some would say that the people in that project were taken because the war trials at Nuremberg were in fact whitewashed to some extent so that they could exploit this knowledge. And we do know, of course, that a number of scientists and engineers arrived in America, including Werner von Braun, with more than 700 other Nazi rocket scientists. Now, to me, that's a prime example of this twilight zone between fact and fiction. And it may produce some significant shifts in our collective awareness of the world, our place in it, and unfortunately the unstated intentions of those who purport to rule us. Now, there's obviously more I can develop from this particular session. That's about as far as I want to go, I think, this morning. Maybe whet your appetite for talks on some of these other aspects later on. There's a whole raft of stuff about the underground world, religious artifacts that were connected into the whole scene. As I said, if you have any interest interest, I'm quite happy to develop it later. So we come to the point that a lot of the Nazi philosophy during World War II was driven by these occult societies. They formed a particular world view, and because it went into the political sphere, it became extremely dangerous and resulted ultimately in classification of Supermen, Untermenschen,